Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about military conflict in the Civil War and government policies, and today we are talking about Reconstruction and the failure of Reconstruction. So if you are ready, let's begin. The first thing that we need to talk about is the impact of the Civil War. Okay, so one of the first big impacts is that there's a massive amount of American deaths. Over 600,000 Americans lose their lives in this war. And the reason that it's so high, it's actually the highest war of all of US history, is because everyone fighting in this war is an American, right? It's America fighting Americans. So even though the North and the Union win and the Union is preserved, there's a massive amount of deaths, okay? Okay, economically, some effects of the Southern economy is destroyed thanks to things like Sherman's March and the war that happened a lot in the South. And the Northern industrialization is going to be accelerated by the war. Their factory system is going to improve, and they're going to be able to use that to, A, win the war, but B, it's going to kind of advance them after the war as well. We saw last time how a lot of Republican laws get passed during the Civil War because in the North, most of the people in the Senate and the House of Representatives, and of course, Abraham Lincoln, are all Republicans. So a lot of their laws are the ones that get passed. But probably the most important idea here of the impacts of war is that the Union is preserved. So the ideas of secession and nullification are defeated. It is now established that you cannot simply leave America. It is required that you are part of it, that states are a part of America. This is the ultimate test for American democracy. But the Civil War proved that we are a union and we need to be together. And also, there's 4 million slaves freed thanks to the 13th Amendment. So let's talk about what Reconstruction is. Okay, so Reconstruction is this term that historians use to talk about the time period directly following the Civil War. And it's basically the attempts of America to try to unify the country after America was just fighting itself for the past 5 years. And so there's a big question here, right? Like, who is going to control Reconstruction? Is the president going to decide how to reunify the country? Is it Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives? Who's going to decide how to do this? Okay. There's another major issue here is that we have all these freed slaves thanks to the 13th Amendment, but all these freed slaves are largely unskilled, illiterate, they don't have money, they don't have property. What's going to happen with all these freed slaves? Okay. Now, these three amendments here are huge, important pieces of information that we need to know for this class. Now, when you hear the word amendment in this class, hopefully you know that means it's a change to the Constitution, like the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, right? So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. These three amendments we got to memorize, okay? 13th abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship and equal protection under the law to everyone born in the US. So this invalidates the Dred Scott decision, okay? And then the 15th Amendment says that all men that are citizens can vote. Okay, so this is adult male suffrage. Women do not get the right to vote out of this. And so the women's rights movement is very upset by this. Okay, so I know this is a little bit of a side idea, but the thought is that women thought, hey, a lot of women were advocating for the abolition of slavery. And when it happens, they thought, well, maybe women will get the right to vote as well with the 15th Amendment, but that does not happen. And while not in this lesson, we're going to talk about this in the future about how women are then going to try to fight for their own right to vote. So we got to have these 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments memorized. Abolishing slavery, citizenship, male voting. Okay, so how does Reconstruction actually happen? How does the country try to get reunified? Now, it starts with presidential Reconstruction. So when the war is over, Abraham Lincoln has this idea called the 10% plan. And he basically, it's very low bar to coming back into America, but he basically says that Southern states can be readmitted if 10% of the voters pledge loyalty. Okay. So a lot of people feel like this is too lenient, but Lincoln has the opinion that America needs to get back together and we need these Southern states to come back. And so that's his plan. But then Abraham Lincoln is assassinated on April 14th, April 15th, 1865. He's shot by John Wilkes Booth while he's watching a play. Now, John Wilkes Booth has a plot to revive the Confederate cause. He wants to kill the Secretary of State and the Vice President. Those two things failed. But he kills Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so this is a major issue. And who is going to become president? Well, Abraham Lincoln's vice president at the time was a Democrat, Andrew Johnson. Now, you should be a little confused right now. Abraham Lincoln's a Republican. He had a Democrat as his vice president. Why did he have that in the election of 1864? Well, he had that to try to reunify the country. Okay, he wanted to show everyone that, look, we can work together. But it is an interesting idea. But when Lincoln's assassinated, that means Andrew Johnson, a Democrat, the party who was more in favor of slavery, is now president. Okay, so it's going to get a little interesting. Now, Johnson's plan for Reconstruction is a little bit different than Lincoln's. Johnson wants all states to ratify the 13th Amendment, saying that all states have to approve that slavery is over. But what Johnson does is he ends up pardoning a lot of former Confederate leaders. So a lot of people who should have maybe were supposed to be thrown in jail or had trials for their role in the secession from America, he pardons them, which means that they're not actually being held accountable for what they did. And a lot of their Southern planters reestablished their control over Southern politics because of this, because people that they thought maybe were going to go to jail for their role in this uprising were not. And as a result, Johnson, the Democrat, pictured here on the right, and Congress are going to get a lot of disputes over how Reconstruction should work. Okay. The presidential Reconstruction, what we just talked about, is kind of the first couple of years of Reconstruction. But after that, we're going to move into a phase called Radical Reconstruction. And this takes place from 1867 to 1877. And Radical Reconstruction means that Reconstruction is going to get more strict. And this is in response to Southerners' actions. Some examples are this guy pictured here, Alexander Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederacy, and then he became a senator from Georgia, right? This is going to make the North very upset, because how could someone who's the vice president of a country who seceded from the Union, how did they get to be a senator? Okay, and he has obviously a lot of views that the North is going to disagree with. There's also these laws in the South called the Black Codes, which we've kind of talked about before. And these are harsh laws that regulate the behavior of African Americans. But a lot of these Black Codes still exist during Reconstruction, even though slavery is over. So, for example, African Americans could be thrown in jail just because they didn't have a job. All right. So, a lot of people in the North and in Congress feel like the South is going too far with how they're handling post Civil War life. They're being too much like they were before the Civil War. All right, so they kind of take over Reconstruction in 1867 with the Reconstruction Act of 1867. So this is a law where basically what they decide is that Congress is now going to be in charge of how we're going to reunify the country. They're going to divide the South into 5 military districts. So basically, all the states in the South get divided up, and now the military for the federal government, the military from the North, is now in charge of the South. Okay. And for states to be readmitted and to get out of this military control, they have to pass new state constitutions. They have to allow black voting. They have to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendment. So Congress in the radical Reconstruction idea takes this thought that we need to be more strict with how we're going to allow the southern states to come back into America. All right. The people who are kind of in charge of radical Reconstruction, we're going to call radical Republicans. Okay, so radical Republicans want to change the balance of power between Congress and the presidency, and they think that Congress should have more power, and they want to reorder race relations in the South, meaning they think that black people need to have more rights and power in the South than they currently did, obviously before the Civil War, but even during presidential Reconstruction immediately afterwards. Okay, so how does this happen? And what do radical Republicans do? Well, first, they try to impeach Andrew Johnson. Okay, so Andrew Johnson had a situation where he removed his Secretary of War without getting the approval of Senate, which is against the law. The president needs approval from the Senate to remove cabinet members. And so they have an impeachment trial, and they were one vote shy of impeaching Andrew Johnson and removing him from office. Okay, so that kind of shows how heated things were between the president and Congress. A lot of times Johnson would veto the laws that Congress passed that were trying to make the South have to do more things to be readmitted or make more black rights happen. And Johnson would veto them, but then Congress would override the veto, which takes 2/3 of the vote. So an example of this is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which provided some protection for citizens that Congress passed. Johnson vetoes, Congress has to override the veto. Okay. So it shows how the Republicans have power. And the last idea here is that they're trying to reorder these race relations, right? So they're trying to put black people in positions of power. And a great example of this is Hiram Revels, which you see pictured on the right. He's the first African-American senator. He's a senator from Mississippi. And a lot of African-American senators in the South held political office during this radical Reconstruction phase. So there are some successes of Reconstruction, and some of the short-term successes are that there's political and leadership opportunities for former slaves. Right, we just saw that with Hiram Revels and with other former slaves. Okay. Another success, and this is a really important term, so bold this, star this, make sure you know this one, Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, so the Freedmen's Bureau is a national government organization that provides food, medicine, clothing, and education to former slaves. So it's trying to answer that question of what do we do with slaves who didn't know how to read, didn't have money. How do we help them? How do we reintegrate them in society? So it provides them, like I said, food, medicine, all that kind of stuff. And it promised this idea of 40 acres and a mule. So like, hey, you can get land, you can get a mule, you can start your own life. That rarely happened, but at least there was some support provided to former slaves. Okay. Now, due to all the new laws like the 15th Amendment, there's a whole new electorate in the South. All these black men are now allowed to vote, which is why we see a lot of the politicians changing immediately following the Civil War. Okay. Another success is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This is another really important one. This guarantees equal access for everyone to public places. It protects African Americans' right to serve on juries. This is a very important civil rights law, and we see this is kind of similar to the Civil Rights Acts that we see passed about 100 years later in the 1960s. But the problem is that a lot of southern states don't enforce this law. And actually, the Supreme Court overturns this law in 1883. But again, short-term success, the passage of this law. And then last short-term success is the Republican coalition. Now, a coalition is like basically who makes up the Republican voters, okay? Obviously, there's some Northerners that were abolitionists or against the idea of slavery. There's also African-American voters. And then there's these two vocab terms that you need to know. One is called scallywags. And scallywag is someone who's a Southern white person who is cooperating with the North. Okay. And then there's these people called carpetbaggers who were Northerners who go south trying to make money off of the situation or trying to help the situation out. Now, a lot of times Southerners would make fun of people by calling them scallywags and carpetbaggers, but we just got to be familiar with these terms and know that these are people that the Republicans could kind of count on. Some Southern people who are cooperating, and then these Northerners who are still going south to try to, again, either profit or to help out. Okay, but we talked about at the beginning of this slide, this whole presentation, right, that Reconstruction fails. So why does it fail? Why isn't the country unified? And there's a few reasons. First, we got to learn about the election of 1876. And that's where we see a Democrat, Samuel Tilden, go up against a Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, in this election, Tilden wins the popular vote. But the problem is he's one vote shy of winning the Electoral College. He only has 184 instead of the 185. This is because 20 of the electoral votes were in dispute in states like Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. And so like each state had sent 2 ballots to Congress, and one ballot said that the Republicans won, one ballot said the Democrats won. It was very confusing, and we basically have a tie. Okay. And so they come up with who's going to be president. Well, they come up with this idea called the Compromise of 1877. And this is very similar to the corrupt bargain, if you remember that, with Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams from the 1820s. Okay. Basically, they decide that Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, is going to be the president in the Compromise of 1877. So he's going to win the election, but he has to promise to withdraw all the military from the South. So those 5 military districts are going to get withdrawn, and the southern states are going to be in charge of themselves before. And so when they do that, a lot of the southern states go back to their, discriminatory laws. Okay. Another reason why Reconstruction fails and this is a College Board term, that's why I started here, is the North's waning resolve. And waning means it's getting less and less and less, right? Less, right? So the North is less passionate about trying to make the country unified again. Okay. Why? Well, there's some economic issues. There's some panics, like the Panic of 1873, which is like another term for like a depression, okay, with economics. The election of 1876, like we just talked about, kind of splits the country a lot. And so a lot of people in the North want to move away from Reconstruction and kind of focus on their own issues. And then the last reason why Reconstruction fails, and this is another big one, is the South is resistant to it. They passed laws called Jim Crow laws, where basically they separate blacks from whites and what they can do. And there's a lot of discriminatory laws. And these laws are on the books for 75 years, okay, well into the 1950s. They have the KKK, a racist group I'm sure you've heard of, that gets established and starts to terrorize and lynch African Americans. And like we talked about before, those black codes that restrict what African Americans are allowed to do. So the South is resisting a lot of these ideas in Reconstruction, and eventually the North kind of just moves on from the situation. Okay. All right. So as this is all happening, well, what's life like for Southern African Americans? Okay. And so we got to talk about this. So we're going to talk about some ideas called land ownership and sharecropping. Okay. And so we need to know, like, before the Civil War, who owned most of the land in the South? Well, it was plantation owners, and they still owned majority of the land. Former slaves had a really hard time getting any land. Just because they're free doesn't mean that they're going to be given land, okay? So a lot of former slaves have difficulty in getting land. They don't have money to do it. That idea from the Freedmen's Bureau of 40 acres and a mule is not always done. And so a lot of African Americans that are former slaves have to end up seeing themselves in as a situation called sharecropping. And this affected former slaves, but it also affected poor white people. And basically what they did is they worked on farms and exchanged their labor for small portions of land and housing. Okay. So basically they would have to give half of the crops that they farmed to the landowner as payment. But what would end up happening is as cotton prices started to fall, they would basically say, hey, the people working on my farm, you guys are in debt. You need to make more. Your harvest wasn't good enough this year. You're never going to be able to get out of the debt that you're in when I gave you this land. So it's kind of like another version of slavery. Even though these sharecroppers, these farmers are allowed to leave, they're kind of held back because they don't have the resources to do so. So while situations are getting better slightly for African Americans, they're still often doing the same work and the same jobs because that's what they knew, and that's kind of the situation they were stuck in. It's hard to get out of. Okay, now I talked a little bit about the Southern resistance to Reconstruction, and I want to highlight it a little bit more specifically because it's super important. So the South is not going to be okay with especially the 14th and 15th Amendments at the time. Okay, they're going to enforce segregation, and that's when blacks and whites are kept separate. And Jim Crow laws are an example of this, and these are laws like, black people have to sit in a certain part of the bus, or black people, the buses aren't around at this time, right? But that's an example from the 60s, okay? So the Jim Crow laws are going to have inferior facilities for African Americans, and it's going to make life separate for them. Okay, there's obviously a lot of violence going on. We talked about that with the KKK lynchings, where they would go around hanging African Americans through mob violence, and a lot of times the people in government in the South, the policemen, the congressmen, were part of the KKK. So it was hard for African Americans to kind of be able to defend themselves. There's some Supreme Court cases that go the ways of the South. Okay, they favor the South. The civil rights case of 1883 basically says that individuals and private businesses are allowed to discriminate. So it's okay if you want to say, hey, I'm not going to hire you because of your race, or I'm not going to sell you that item because of your race. That was allowed because of some civil rights cases that went on in 1883. And then a monumental Supreme Court case. This is another super important one we got to memorize, is Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Basically what happens is an African-American man named Homer Plessy, he sues and he says, look, I shouldn't have to be segregated on a train car, okay? Shouldn't be all black cars and all white cars. And he sues, and the Supreme Court says that Jim Crow laws are okay. They have this idea called separate but equal, that things are allowed to be separate as long as they provide equal access. As long as there's two train cars, it's technically equal, and so that they're allowing this equal access. And this is going to make segregation essentially legal all the way into the 1950s. So this is a huge Supreme Court case. Make sure we know that one, Plessy versus Ferguson. And then the last way that the South is going to show resistance to the 14th and especially the 15th Amendment is they got political tactics that are going to decrease the vote of African Americans. So they're going to have things like poll taxes where you have to pay money to vote. Well, who has the least amount of money? Former slaves. This also affects poor white people, but former slaves, okay? They do things like literacy tests where they create these like really difficult tests where you have to like show that you're literate to vote, which were basically impossible to pass. And certain people didn't have to take them, and others did. African Americans, former slaves, had to take them. So it's a way to prevent them from voting. And the last is something called the grandfather clause, where basically you could vote if your grandpa could vote. Well, here's a situation in the 1870s, right? The grandparents of former slaves were slaves, right? So they couldn't vote, and so all these African Americans who were former slaves weren't allowed to vote. Okay, so when this happens, the Republican Party, especially in the South, they start to lose a lot of their elections, right? Because the poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clause, they're all suppressing the vote of the Republicans, and they make it easier for the Democrats to win and then pass more laws that promote segregation or Jim Crow laws. Okay. All right, so the last concept here is kind of taking what we've learned in the 14th and 15th Amendments, and bring it to the 1900s because it's really important. The situation that happens with Plessy versus Ferguson and the Civil Rights Acts and the different amendments, they have a lot of impact over the next 75 years on race relations in America. So these amendments, the 14th and 15th Amendments, are going to be the basis for a lot of law that gets passed in the beginning. They're going to really restrict African American rights. But as we get into the 50s and 60s, we just need to be aware that these racist Jim Crow laws are going to get reversed. Okay. And they're going to bring up ideas. There's a Supreme Court case we got to know called Brown v. Board of Ed, which we'll talk about more when we get to that unit. But I just want to be able to make sure you can make these connections that reverses Plessy versus Ferguson and says that second but equal is not okay. So we do see that these amendments are later going to be used to help out African Americans. But for the time being, in the late 1800s, life is very difficult for African Americans, even though they win their freedom. Okay,